But first, I recognize the representative of ICRAC. You have the floor, sir.
Thank you very much, Chair. My general comments here want to focus on the question of using agreed language when identifying risks. Indeed, delegations have emphasized the importance of using agreed language. In our understanding, agreed language does not only mean language included in previous reports of this group, but also includes language found in IHL and other binding sources of international law. There are three phrases or terminologies currently, Chair, on the screen in reply to your prompts that we want to focus on. The first phrase is the phrase unintended engagements, which does not appear in the text of the CCW or the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocol. Does the risk of unintended engagements mean the risk of unintended killing of civilians or protected persons? If that is the case, it is better to keep to IHL language on indiscriminate attacks or civilian harm. Second, phrases like algorithmic bias or simply bias do not sufficiently capture the risk being referred to. In its place, it may be better, for example, to talk about the risk of discrimination or the risk of gender or racial discrimination, phrases which exist in binding legal norms. Third, the phrase risk mitigation equally does not appear in the text of the CCW or the Geneva Conventions and their additional protocols. It is critical that we explain what we mean by this and how this aligns with established international legal obligations, such as those that are found under international humanitarian law. Chair, some risks that are posed by laws already necessitate compliance with state obligations that exceed mere risk mitigation. Let me just give two examples, Chair. Let's talk about the risk of arbitrary deprivation of the right to life due to failure to comply with IHL rules of distinction, for example. The obligation there is an obligation of prohibition on arbitrary deprivation of life. It is not an obligation to mitigate that particular risk. So when we say we are trying to mitigate risk, we need to be clear which particular risk we are referring to. If you look, for example, at the risk of racial and gender discrimination, the existing international obligations on state is to eliminate all forms of racial and gender discrimination. It is not to mitigate that particular risk. So it is very important in this particular regard for us to have some clarity. Lastly, it is evident, Chair, that certain risks posed by laws entail international obligations that surpass mere risk mitigation. While introducing new terms is permissible, caution must be exercised to avoid terminologies that undermine existing obligations. In cases where clear state obligations pertain to specific risks, any proposed risk mitigation should be regarded only as supplementary to existing obligations. With that, Chair, I thank you.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of ICRAC for indeed reminding us to already existing obligations. And I'm looking at the next on my list is the United States. You have the floor.
To respond to the point that the delegate from ICRAC just raised, the U.S. delegation considers the risk of unintended engagements to mean that the weapons system is engaging targets that the system operator did not intend to engage. So in that sense, it's broader than just civilian harm. And then lastly, on the issue of bias, we would recommend describing the risk as unintended bias in AI capabilities. We suggest to add the word unintended to be more specific about the type of bias that are problematic. Indeed, distinction is an important IHL requirement. We also think it is appropriate to refer to AI capabilities rather than just generally to AI.
Then I will now pass the floor to ICRAC, and then we'll see where we stand. Thank you.
Once again, thank you, Chair. My apologies for taking the floor again. I want to start by expressing appreciation to the US delegation for their response. The first thing which we want to emphasize again is the question that consensus language in the UNGG reports is important but must not be inconsistent with existing IHL language or other obligations. In relation first to the aspect of unintended engagement, which the delegation has explained that this refers to the system engaging targets other than those authorized by the operator. Does this mean then that the system has autonomy in critical functions? Does this not fall under autonomous weapon systems that must be prohibited rather than mitigated? In relation to the second point on unintended bias, what again is meant by this? Chair, in terms of Rule 88 of customary international humanitarian law, the words that are used is adverse distinction. And in terms of international human rights law treaties to which delegates or states are party, the term that is used is the right to non-discrimination. In our view, the risk here can be properly identified as risk to the right to non-discrimination. The word unintended is not helpful because gender and racial discrimination or any other form of discrimination is not only harmful because it is intended, it is harmful because it is discrimination. And as ICROC, we insist on using language that already exists in binding treaties. Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. We have me moving around. Okay. I think it was a long day, and we had a long of very, very good discussions. You gave us some homework. I'm already recognizing the US. You will get the floor in a moment. We will certainly start doing homework on streamlining, categorizing. That might help also future discussions. But I will now first pass the floor to the distinguished representative of the United States. Sir, you have the floor for further comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just in the spirit of interactivity, wanted to respond to the 2 points raised by our distinguished civil society representative from ICRAC, and just to provide a further clarification on our thinking on those very important topics. First, with regard to the concept of unintended engagement, again, this is a core concept underlying U.S. policy relating to autonomy in weapon systems. It's the thrust of our DoD Directive 3000.09, autonomy in weapon systems, is trying to reduce the probability of risks and failures that could lead to this outcome. The directive defines unintended engagement as, and I'll just read it out, the use of force against persons or objects that commanders or operators did not intend to be the targets of U.S. military operations, including unacceptable levels of collateral damage beyond those consistent with the law of war, rules of engagement, and commander's intent. And so the thrust of this policy is to really try and align the use of force in military operations as much as possible with commander's intent, and that includes commander's intentions to reduce collateral damage or risk of harm to civilians as much as possible, and to fully implement our IHL obligations. So we view this concept as a very important one in the context of autonomy weapon systems, and it's very useful for aligning the effects of the weapon with the intentions of the users. Therefore, just to respond to the question, we think it's relevant in particular with regard to lawful weapons, weapons that are not inherently discriminate or prohibited from use in all circumstances, but it's a consideration that we believe is applicable with regard to semi-autonomous and autonomous weapon systems that are lawful and may be used consistent with IHL rules. So, one wanted to just provide that further clarification and information in response to that good question about unintended engagements. I think the other issue our distinguished colleague raised was with regard to our proposal with regard to unintended artificial intelligence, unintended bias in artificial intelligence capabilities. And we, in particular, wanted to add the notion of unintended before bias. And I take the point that our colleague raised, which was a very good one, that there are obligations related to discrimination in international human rights law. That there certainly is a core IHL obligation requiring humane treatment without adverse distinction based on a number of criteria. And of course, that's found in Common Article 3 of the 1949 Geneva Conventions, as well as other critical IHL instruments. And of course, we believe these are very important obligations and need to be strictly adhered to. I think the legal point that we would make is that these obligations about refraining from discrimination or requiring humane treatment without adverse distinction are applicable to people. And this is, of course, reflected in the 2019 GGE report, where it was emphasized that, rules of IHL apply to states, they apply to parties to a conflict, they apply to individuals, not machines. And so we don't see the reference to bias when we're talking about AI bias as referring to these legally prohibited categories of discrimination, because we don't regard those legal obligations as applicable to the machines. When we're referring to AI bias, we're talking about a very technical phenomenon with regard to the programming of artificial intelligence capabilities. And I think it's a subject of much discussion and much expert interest. It's not necessarily connected to these legal categories that are protected from discrimination, but the general phenomenon is that when machine learning or AI systems are used, they can reflect various biases that are present in the training data. And one of the key efforts to promote good practices with regard to responsible AI is to try and mitigate those biases. But again, I think the key point I would emphasize is these are very technical biases presented in the training data, and they're not necessarily connected to things that we regard as protected criteria under international human rights law or international humanitarian law. So that's why we think the word unintended is important, because in the case of some AI models, there's a deliberate intent to bias the model's output, and we think that can be quite positive, a positive effect, including to enhance discrimination and precision in the use of force as required by IHL. So hopefully this is a helpful contribution to the discussion, and I thank you, Mr. Chair and colleagues.
Thank you for that. Then again, looking forward to tomorrow. I think we will have... are we going to continue the discussion on bias? Yeah? Okay. I have no bias to that. Please, go ahead. Austria. The distinguished representative of Austria, you have the floor.
I think everyone has deserved to go home at this moment. But it's a very interesting topic, and I think it's a concept that deserves a little bit more attention. The big question here is, is there unintended bias or not? I mean, it's a conceptual question, probably one we should agree. There are different ways of seeing it. We see it, and this comes probably also from the kind of work that has been done in other international organizations on AI, as something that is per se unintended. The problem, if you talk about bias, is that bias is a reflection of something that is already intrinsic in societies. If you talk about bias in our context, any kind of discrimination that is there to comply with IHL is not bias. It is something that has been deliberately programmed into the system to comply with IHL. In that case, it is not bias, because bias would more or less be an accident. And I mean, we had this discussion today. There are different types of biases. There is the kind of bias that stems from faulty data sets or faulty, not programming, but kind of the way the data sets are selected, implemented, maintained. Also the cognitive biases that exist in human existence, or the way that the human brain works. I mean, I have here a list that includes stereotyping, bandwagon effect, priming, selective perception, or confirmation bias. Those are just cognitive biases that you can see in everyday's world, and that are then introduced into an algorithmic system. And then you have something that has come up often today, real-life prejudices, which are racial bias, gender bias, and so on. So it's a very wide area. It's all, in most cases, faulty. It is not intentional, and a bias that is there for having kind of a positive discrimination on a battlefield, in our interpretation, is not a bias, but it is something that has been placed there to comply with IHL. Thank you.
Thank you for that explanation. Yes, we have one more, the distinguished representative of Guatemala. I'm just looking, you have the floor.
Finally, would like to support the comments made by other delegations on the need to eliminate risks that are incompatible with IHL and not simply limit ourselves to mitigation.
And still in this round, the distinguished representative of the European Union. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair. I would like to make a general comment and one of a more specific nature on risk mitigation. The European Union is of the view that tailored risk mitigation measures, including those across the life cycle, should be adopted and implemented. And with regard to the question of risk, with regard to the development and use of laws, and specifically on ballot 4, the EU recognizes the critical role that data plays for AI-based technologies. Social biases that have a potential impact on emerging technologies, for example, through gender bias in algorithms, should also be given due consideration. Thank you.
I would like to thank the distinguished representative of the European Union, and next on my list is the UK. You have the floor. And I recognize the distinguished representative of Austria. Sir, you have the floor.
We cannot reinterpret or scale down existing international law. This is something we definitely should not do, even if we have instruments where not all parties are part of. But for most of the obligations that are widely adhered to, especially with the Geneva Conventions, it's extremely important that we do not do something like this.
I recognize the representative of ICRAC, sir. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's just a really quick intervention on the utility of legal reviews as a mitigation measure. Chair, we acknowledge that actually legal reviews are important and are critical and can be able to serve this purpose. But I think there is an important point that we ought to remember. Legal reviews, in other words, they are conducted in accordance with existing international law, existing international humanitarian law, and other relevant legal norms. Now, Chair, one of the key questions that is yet to be answered, or for delegations to yet to find common ground, is whether existing law, the law in actual fact that we use when we conduct legal reviews, is adequate to govern lethal autonomous weapon systems. Now, ICRC and other notable stakeholders, they have noted that existing law may not be adequate to govern autonomous weapon systems. Now, in that regard, Chair, legal reviews utility in this particular point become very limited because we'll be in a way using a measure or a scale that is inadequate to try and see whether, for example, a weapon is acceptable in terms of law. So that is a point which we just want to underline to say legal reviews utility can only be useful where existing law is adequate to govern the particular weapon that we are dealing with.
Thank you for that remark. And of course, one of the big questions here is indeed whether and how much additional regulation we need. So then, in the end, the problem could be solved. But yes, as we stand now, you might really have a point. And I recognize the distinguished representative of Austria. Sir, you have to...
Another point that we want to reinforce is also the very valuable point by ICRAC. If we go into something, and I think this is a very popular risk mitigation measures and also an important one when it comes to implementation of IHL, which are the legal reviews, you always have to have a strong set of legality that you test against. And if we have the problem, as the colleague has pointed out, that there are unclarities or gaps in the existing legal framework, then this has to be filled first for these legal reviews to be fully effective.